This video is going to illustrate to you how to take a loan amortization schedule and use the information that's provided in that schedule to complete a part of a year-end balance sheet. So in the left-hand panel, I've got an illustrated amortization schedule for a $50,000 loan for 5 years at 6%. We're going to assume the loan was made in 2014, July 1st, and then the first payment's due July 1st, 2015, then the next payment July 1st, 2016, and so on. I chose July 1st since it's a half a year and it makes the calculation of the accrued interest easier by just using a half. Also, I'm not using monthly payments or quarterly payments because the purpose here is just to illustrate where things go on the balance sheet. The idea of constructing the amortization schedule is another topic. In the right-hand panel, we've got an illustrated balance sheet. We're going to assume it's for December 31st, 2015, because in class we're assuming the end of the fiscal year is the same as the calendar year. Okay, so in order to complete the liability side of a balance sheet, there's a couple of places that you have to have an amortization schedule to come up with the dollar amounts. Over on the illustrated 2015 balance sheet, you're going to need an amortization schedule in order to complete these two entries, the current portion of term debt, which we will explain, and the accrued interest. Okay? You're also going to need amortization schedules down in non-current farm liabilities in order to complete the notes payable for machinery, breeding stock, and land mortgages. So what we're going to illustrate in this particular video is how you use an amortization schedule to complete the balance sheet for the categories that are in gray. Let me go ahead and finish that out. Okay, so these two gray background set of cells is you will need information from the amortization schedules to complete those. Do not forget that you would need an amortization schedule for every single farm term loan. So if you had a loan on a couple of different pieces of machinery, if you had a loan for some breeding stock, which would be replacement cows or herd bulls, or if you had a mortgage on land, all of those would require an amortization schedule. And when you start moving values from the amortization schedule over to the balance sheet, you would have to sum those numbers for each one of the term loans. So as I show you where numbers go off the amortization schedule over to the balance sheet, please remember, it's not just for one loan. You would have to go to every one of your term loans and sum that number in order to get the entry that goes on the balance sheet. And of course, when you go to these amortization schedules, they're going to be in different years. Every loan's not going to be started in 2014, so you'd have to make sure that you pick the right year to get the information. Okay, don't forget that when you do the loan amortization schedule, when you look at any one year, let's look at 2015. This is what's true about that loan at the end of 2015. In other words, you made a payment in 2015 of $11,870. $8,870 was principal and $3,000 was interest, and at the end of the year the loan balance was $41,130. Okay, we're not going to deal with the accrued interest for a moment. We'll come back to that shortly. But remember, this is as of the end of the year. So if you're sitting there 12/31/2015, the line in gray here has already happened. But the next line, the 2016, is what's coming up in about 6 months, because that's what will happen in July of 2016. Okay, so keep that in mind. When you go over to the balance sheet over here, the current liabilities, when you talk about these different things that are payable, those are things that not have been paid in 2015. 2015 is over. These things that are due to be paid in 2016, because current liabilities, the word current implies a 1-year time frame. So all of these items here are what is due in the coming year, not in the year that's already passed. That's a very critical point in understanding this balance sheet. So if that was not clear, I would encourage you to hit the rewind button a little and listen to that again. Okay, a current portion of term debt. What goes in this cell right here? Well, that refers to the principal that's due on a term loan in the coming year. So if you go back over here to this amortization schedule, remember this 2015 has already happened. So what is due in the next year during 2016? Well, during 2016, what you've got is $9,402 worth of principal that's going to be due in 2016. Not the interest portion, the principal. The interest has not all accrued yet, just the principal. But the principal you know you had to pay because that's paying the banker back his money. So what happens is this current portion of term debt, you could simply type equals, and it's the next year's principal that's actually due there. It is so common for students when they would put a number in this cell right here, they want to go to the 2015. They say, what's a 2015 balance sheet? You got to put the 2015 number. Common sense. That number's already over. That was paid 6 months ago. The current liabilities refer to what's due in the coming year. So you always go to the next year. All right. Down here where it says accrued interest, okay, that's the amount of interest that would not necessarily what's due next July. That's the amount of interest that would be due today, December 31st, if you paid the loan off. Okay, well, you go back to the amortization schedule, and that's this number right there. In 2015, at the end of the year, that's how much interest has accrued. And if you'll notice, that's actually half of the next year's interest. Because remember, we're making payments at the midpoint of the year. So this accrued interest is what would go in this cell right here. This would be this accrued interest. Okay, so let's go back and talk about that for just a second to make sure you understand. When you do the current farm liabilities, anything that's payable, which is a liability, is what's payable as of December 31st, what's going to be payable within the next year. Okay? So you say, okay, the current portion of term debt. In other words, that's how much of the principal on that debt that's due next year. Okay? The accrued interest is what portion of next year's interest is actually due today, December 31st. So you get that current portion of term debt from the next year's principal, and you get the accrued interest from the current year's accrued interest column. Okay. Now remember, you would have to add all of the different term debts together to get these two numbers. So if you had an amortization schedule for, say, 4 different term loans, one for machinery, one for breeding stock, one for land, you would have to go to the right year to add up the current portion of term debt for all of those loans and the accrued interest on all those loans, and that what would actually go into the current liabilities of the current year's balance sheet. Now, looking back over here at the amortization schedule, December 31st, 2015. You know the current portion of term debt is that next year's principal. But then after next year's principal, how much is the remaining, how much is remaining on the entire loan? In other words, after you pay next year's principal, which is at 9,402, at the end of next year there'll be 31,728 that still hadn't been paid. In other words, it's the loan balance after next year's principal payment. Okay? That $31,728 is not due next year. So it's not a current liability, but it does have to be paid. So it becomes a non-current liability. So let's just suppose for a moment that this loan is on machinery. So when you come down here under non-current liability, say for machinery right here, then what would go there would be that loan balance at the end of next year. Because that's how much of that loan is due after the next year's current principal payment. Now, if that doesn't make sense, I would encourage you to hit rewind, back up, and listen to that again. And again, you would have to add that loan balance up for all different term loans that you might have. So you see, when you've got an amortization schedule, you always need, for any one year, you need the next year's principal, you need the current year's accrued interest, and then you need the next year's outstanding loan balance. And those 3 bits of information will flow directly to either the current farm liabilities or the non-current farm liabilities for all of your term debt. Just as a quick note, the non-current farm liabilities is essentially all term debt. Everything that goes in any of these categories would be referring to the balance after next year's payment on all different term loans. So if you had a real estate loan, if you had a breeding livestock loan, machinery, those would all be due. You'll notice that the way it's set up, and I'm using the same kind of the same format as the textbook. Notes payable, and we're breaking those notes into machinery and breeding stock, and then of course just real estate debt. Some balance sheets just call it balance on term debt and put them all together, but then some break it into categories, and that's just a matter of preference. For quiz purposes, I am not going to ask you to build an amortization schedule because that's not the purpose in this particular case. What I will do is give you an amortization schedule. It'll have all these values in there. I'll give it to you for more than one loan. So you'll probably have two or maybe three. And then what I will ask you on the quiz is what would go into the current portion of term debt, the accrued interest, and down here I'll tell you whether the loans are machinery or breeding stock or whatever. I'll tell you what kind of category they are. So you won't have to do the calculations on the amortization schedule, but you will have to know to sum across all the term debt and get it into the proper category over here under current and non-current farm liabilities.